An aperture is a hole or an opening through which light travels. The aperture setting on your camera affects two things. It affects depth of field and exposure. The depth of field is the portion of a scene that appears sharp in the image. The aperture is used to control the amount of depth of field recorded. By choosing the correct aperture, the photographer has the choice of showing greater depth of field or less depth of field within the image. How much of the image should be in focus is another decision you need to make when setting up your shot. Do you want your subject clear and the background blurry? The numbers listed on your screen right now are the standard aperture settings found on most cameras. The aperture setting is also called the f-stop. Your camera may not go all the way down to f1.4 or all the way up to f32, but you will likely have most of these f-stops. The smaller f-stops, for example f2.8 or f4, open the aperture wider and result in less depth of field or a smaller amount of focus in front of and behind the subject. The larger f-stops, so for example f11 or f16, open a smaller aperture and result in greater depth of field or a larger amount of focus in front of and behind the subject. The images that you're seeing on your screen right now were taken with a minimum f-stop, f4, and a maximum f-stop of f22. The f22 image has a greater depth of field, so more of the foreground and background is sharp. As well as the aperture being used to control depth of field, the aperture is also used to control the amount of light hitting the film or sensor, and it is half of the tools necessary for exposure. The shutter is the second part of the equation needed for correct exposure. The smaller f-stops, so for example f2 or 2.8, allow the lens to have a bigger opening or a larger aperture, allowing more light to pass through the lens to strike the film or sensor. Higher f-stops, like f16 or f22, set the lens to a smaller aperture and therefore allow less light through the lens. Moving a full stop from one adjacent f-stop to the next allows either double or half the amount of light through, depending on which way it is that you're moving. For example, having an original f-stop of f11 and then moving to f16 will allow half the amount of light through. On the screen, you're able to see pictures that have been taken with a one-stop decrease in exposure value by only changing the aperture or f-stop. Therefore, the f5.6 exposure is twice as dark as the f4 exposure. The f16 exposure is twice as dark as the f22 exposure. Looking at it the other way, the f4 exposure is twice as bright as the f5.6 exposure, and the f11 exposure is twice as bright as the f16 exposure, and so on.